All right. Welcome, everybody. We're going to just take a couple minutes to let everybody pile in here. Then we'll get going. If you want in the chat, or if you're brave, you can go ahead and speak up. Love to know where you're all joining from. I'm in Boulder, Colorado, right by the Rocky Mountains.
I am in Bellingham, Washington.
Oh, very cool, Sean.
Cool. Love to see in the chat where people are calling in from.
Yeah, this is always so fun. It's usually just around the world. Tokyo, wow. Malta, Sweden. Very fun. All right. Wait, maybe one more minute. And this is being recorded, so don't feel like you need to take notes or anything. We'll share the recording afterwards for your reference. All right, let's get going. So yeah, this is a webinar put on by Pragmatic and Storybook with our friends at Khan Academy, and we're going to be discussing pragmatic accessibility testing for developers. Well, I'll introduce in just a second. But I do want to make a note. We welcome any of your questions, either in the dedicated Q&A tool as part of Zoom or just in your chat. And we will do our best to answer those either as part of the presentation or in a dedicated Q&A session at the end. So let's get going here. So companies are facing bigger accessibility challenges than they ever have before. As developers, we are the ones facing the brunt of those compliance challenges. And so this webinar is about pragmatic ways, really practical, on-the-ground ways to approach accessibility for developers. It's for folks who are accountable for accessibility, but might not have the training, the budget, or the support from your organization yet. And accessibility can feel like a checklist, a legal risk, and a mystery all rolled into one. And it's also critical for everyone to have equal access to what we build. So, for those reasons, I'm delighted to have Marcy here with us. She's an award-winning accessibility expert. She's produced multiple accessibility courses and workshops, and she's a contributor to AxeCore, which I think you're going to see is kind of the foundation of a lot of the tools we're going to be talking about here. Marcy, is there anything else you'd like to say?
Sure. Thanks for the introduction. I guess I could start by saying that I'm a front-end developer and I found accessibility along the way and learned that I really care about it. So, as you said, whether you're in a specialist role for accessibility or you are building literally anything on the front end, accessibility is a way that you can support people. And I happen to think it's really cool. So I'm very excited to be here to chat about it. We can get geeky and learn about ways that we can actually have a positive impact in the digital world.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you. And I am Kyle Gatch. I'm a DX engineer at Storybook or Pragmatic. I've always worked between like the intersection between design and development, and I've found that accessibility is one of the key things in that intersection because it affects both and it's impacted by both. Yeah, Yeah. So I primarily do like the learning materials for Storybook or like the blog posts that are published, that sort of work, the documentation. Um, so I just want to stress that this webinar is not like an accessibility 101. Accessibility is a broad discipline that would be impossible to cover in an hour. And so for the sake of our time and to really like focus the conversation, we're going to skip the introductions. And if the basics are what you're after, like go sign up for Marcy's course. Not to say it's basic, but just it covers the basics and more. So that would be an excellent way to learn accessibility. But this discussion is about the tactics that'll help you reach compliance and stay there. Accessibility has always been essential because there's always been people with varying abilities and disabilities that need access to what we're building. And the courts agree. There's the ADA in the US and the EU Accessibility Act that's coming soon in June, and both of those dictate that our digital properties must be accessible to um, everyone that's possible. So the teams around the world are scrambling to figure out how to achieve accessibility compliance. So these are some of the common challenges we've heard. Like you've got a lot of debt in your app today. It's really hard to address accessibility issues without stopping like your regular releases. It's hard to balance automation and manual auditing. Sometimes the process itself can be inaccessible to people that need to be part of it. Like one of the very best ways to address accessibility is to get people that use assistive technology to actually try to use your product. And sometimes the process through which that feedback happens is itself inaccessible. Getting timely reports during development of like whether or not you're succeeding in making your product accessible. It's kind of related to shifting left in an automated way. All of these things are what we've heard from customers and users that make it difficult to make the app accessible or at least start that process. And we believe developers are ultimately the ones accountable for delivering the compliant code. After all, the rendered code that the users see or hear or feel as assistive technology allows, that's what the regulators examine to ultimately determine compliance. And so we're going to propose this new way of verifying accessibility that is made for developers. It's made for components and pages. It tracks your audits over time. It's reliant on heavy automation, and it provides real-time reporting. And just to be clear, the goal here is WCAG, or the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, the 2.1A and AA, because that is what the ADA, Section 508, the EU Act that's coming, all of those are based on this level of compliance. And it's also what Axe Core uses by default. But should you want to go above and beyond, which you should, because there are better guidelines available, WCAG is up to 2.2 currently, and there's also a AAA level. And these tools could be configured to check for those as well. But yeah, that's the goal, is to meet the requirements that are coming down legally.
Can I add here
Yes, absolutely.
before we
Please
move
do.
on?
Let me try to go back. For some reason, it's not letting me.
Okay, well, I was just going to say
Yeah.
that compliance is the starting point, right? So, like, you can have
Yes.
something compliant that is really hard to use. So, we want things that are accessible, usable, kind of going beyond compliance. The guidelines are a really great tool to use and like how to get there. Just know that like usability is a factor as well.
Yes. Great point. Thank you, Marcy. There we go. So how do we do that? Because the apps we're building they're complex. They have multiple states. They're more personalized than ever. There's a lot to keep track of, and it can be hard. So let me walk through why it can be difficult. So you have, let's say, a single component like this chart here. That component can have lots of states, can also have lots of themes or modes. And so Oh, and sometimes you end up building the component and then another team has already built it and you didn't even know because it wasn't properly documented. Keeping track of all of this UI is really tough. And trying to test it, or accessibility test it in particular, can be even harder. There's a lot of surface area there. And especially when you first test an app for accessibility, it can be overwhelming. So there's an approach here that we found that can provide you kind of a foothold to get going, and it's called component-driven testing or component-driven development. So our core insight here is that front-end quality has to happen at the atomic level with components first. We believe that how products are made impact the end user experience. And so if you build your product component first, that's going to provide the best end user experience. So traditional testing tools are meant to verify pages one by one. Either you do that manually or you can even automate it through like end-to-end testing. And that's fine for like small sites or apps, but for large, complex, the types of apps that most of us are working on today, it's time consuming and it can be expensive for the apps that have tens of thousands of components and states. So developers now find the best practice of building component first, and you can reuse those components to speed up the development. But if you introduce an error in a component, it also gets distributed to every instance, which is true for accessibility too. And so like you can see how that component is reused across multiple pages. If it works, that's great. But when there's an error, that also means there's errors across all of those pages. And so, yeah, we've really found that this is a good strategy, in particular for accessibility testing, because of the way that accessibility violations can kind of ripple throughout your app, starting with the basic components and going through to the pages. And I'll show you a tool in a bit that that's built on that principle. But first, I want to walk through some accessibility testing strategies because ultimately you need a mix. No one tool is like the silver bullet for these things. So there's manual testing where you literally just pull it up and you either use a screen reader yourself, or ideally you find somebody that is a screen reader expert and uses it daily and ask them to try to use your product, which is super accurate, but slow. And if you're hiring somebody to do that, it can be expensive.
Can I interject? Also,
Please,
in a sense,
yes.
so this manual step is essential for anyone. If you're building a UI, a manual step that you could factor in that, like, I encourage everyone to do: test with your keyboard. When you tab through, can you reach and operate every interactive control? Can you see a focus outline? And key into interactive, like if a mouse user can do an action, you need to be able to operate it from the keyboard as well. So that manual step, like, you're always going to need that because the automated tooling, like, that's kind of a more advanced tool.
Mm,
But you're right that, like, it is kind of a slow process. So you want other tools to add to the party. So continue.
yeah. Thank you. Thank you. That's a good nuance, or good like color. So the next strategy would be hiring a pro auditor. So this is usually a like professional consultancy that comes in and they assess your entire app page by page by page and produce a report, usually a VPAT or voluntary uh, product accessibility
Template.
something template. Thank you. um, which is a really useful report for auditors and for legal folks, but not so useful for developers in the day to day. It can be really hard to extract like a to-do list from those things. And so, again, just like Marcy said, like manual is necessary. Don't skip that. Pro auditor is necessary to kind of like prove your compliance. It's not the end of being accessible. There's always work to be done above that, but it is necessary, but it's expensive and it's often late in the process. And so that brings us to our third accessibility testing strategy, which is automated. And we recommend you start here because it's fast. It provides a really quick feedback loop as you're testing and fixing, but it's incomplete. You still need the manual and the pro auditor in this. And so I just really want to make it clear that while we're going to focus on automated for most of the rest of this presentation, it is not the only thing that you need. It's just what we're able to best provide.
Yeah, there's only certain parts that can be automated, right? And we'll get
Right.
into that a little bit
Yes.
more. But like,
Yes, certainly.
it's hard to automate totally inaccessible stuff. It's like a chicken and egg problem a little bit.
Hmm.
Like if you've got something that's only wired up to work with the mouse, you can't exactly write accessibility tests for it. You could do some test-driven development though and fix it.
Sure. Sure. Yeah.
So
That's
it's a
I never thought about that chicken and the egg. That's interesting.
yeah.
Um, so going into a little more detail, just to be clear what I'm talking about here. So manual testing often looks like pulling up in your browser, like I said, using a screen reader, but also you could do some testing manually too by like using Google's Lighthouse or Axe's DevTools. These are browser extensions. Um, it's a good way to just kind of like get a quick snapshot of what's going on without setting up any additional tooling. So this is a useful tool, but it could be slow to have to manually pull up your app, especially if you have to build your entire app just to pull up the browser extension. These also check the entire page. And so it's kind of hard to narrow down the violations to just like an individual component that you're responsible for or you're currently working on, because they do check the entire page. And then the professional audit, I guess I kind of covered all this already, but yeah, sometimes for larger organizations, this could be an in-house team. Oftentimes it's a paid contractor. And yeah, they're producing a like very professional report, not so much meant for developers.
Sometimes, I guess I could add there,
Hmm.
sometimes the process of an audit, you will get JIRA issues. So it does get broken down
Oh,
like
okay.
from the mega report that's probably in a spreadsheet, you know, often the process includes specific issues and tickets that developers or even designers might be responsible for fixing. Once those are fixed, you submit them for validation. We do that at Khan Academy. Lots of
Hmm.
places do because it's good to get that outside expertise on a product because sometimes we have our own biases or maybe we just aren't set up to test things in the same way. So the professional audit piece is pretty important, like you say, for the actual compliance part.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. Okay, so moving on to automated. This will often like you can integrate automated accessibility testing into lots of testing tools like Jest, VTest, Playwright, Cypress. I'm going to show you how it integrates into Storybook in just a minute. And the nice thing about automated is it works um, like locally as you're developing and in CI. And I do see the questions over here talking about like, well, aren't Lighthouse and Axe automated? And yeah, they are in that like you push a button and it runs a bunch of tests, but you still had to push that button. What I'm using as a distinction for automated is like it runs like when you submit a PR, for example. Like it runs in your CI in an automatic fashion without you having to think about it. And that's really key because otherwise you have to remember to go look at every page in your app and press the button. Like, I don't know about you, but I would never remember every page and push the button every time. Like, I will make mistakes in that process. And so, if we have a tool that's doing it for me, it helps ensure that those mistakes are caught. And so, putting these things all together, it's kind of, you can think of it in layers where you do like the automated one first because it is fastest and least expensive. And then you do some manual work as a developer yourself. You do some manual checking. You can also have an expert do this manual checking, and then you have an expert do like an actual audit, like a paid compliance audit. And all of these things are like layers of defense for making sure that your app is accessible. And that's why automated testing is so key, is because it's that first layer that you as a developer are most empowered to use. And all of these things add up into this kind of like shift left philosophy where by finding the issues and fixing the issues much earlier in the development process, it's cheaper, it's smoother, it has less of an impact on your velocity. It is just a more kind, friendly way to work, is what I've found. Um, so with that kind of like introduction, I want to talk about Storybook Test, which is this suite of tools that we've been building in the Storybook team, and it includes accessibility tests, which is what I'm going to focus on here. And so now let's do a demo. Let's see. I think if I do this. Okay. So this is a Storybook app. I've just got some really basic components, and I put some fake accessibility issues in here. So I would really hope that nobody would actually have a button that looks that gray on a white background. But in this case, that's what I've done. Um, and so first I want to show you the accessibility add-on. So this has existed for a long time in Storybook. It's probably Storybook's most popular add-on actually that isn't built in. Um, and you can just use it manually in a sense by like pulling open, like let's say button, primary. Okay, I've got this violation here, or I'm going to go back to the form here. So I've got this violation. It's telling me elements must meet minimum color contrast ratio, and this all comes from Axe Core. So remember when I mentioned that Marcy was an Axe Core contributor? Well, everything that you're seeing here, as far as the actual testing and the guidance, all of that stuff is built on top of Axe Core. So, and that's true for Google's Lighthouse. It's true for so many tools. It is truly a foundational tool that they DQ very graciously makes available for open source. So this is telling me that this particular button doesn't have the ratio. And I'm like, oh, well, I wonder what button that is. Well, I can highlight it, or I can even jump specifically to the element. Or if I don't want to deal with all of this and I just want to keep it here, let me, sorry, let me show the highlights again. And then I can click and I get like in context details about this violation. So this is just the accessibility add-on. This is available to pretty much every Storybook. I don't know of any limitations on that. But we've been building something, Storybook Test I mentioned, and that adds this test widget to your sidebar. And what it does is it actually turns, as long as you're using Vite with your Storybook, it can turn your stories. Just a quick primer. A story is where you take a component and you render it with some certain state and props and things like that. And so it'll take your stories and turn them into vtest tests. And then it can do what we call interactions tests, which is like a functional, but it also do accessibility tests alongside those. And so let me just run these tests real quick. So it's got 12 tests there. They're already done. And I have 9 warnings. So if I look here, it's telling me I have accessibility issues. And so I'm not going to waste your time. These are all accessibility issues. And so this is what I meant by the first time you run an accessibility testing suite, it can be overwhelming. You just like see errors everywhere. And so what we recommend is to go to your simplest component that has errors. So in this case, that's my button. So I'm going to go here and I'm going to find those accessibility errors. So I've got button, it's that color contrast issue. And so now I'm going to go into my code and I'm going to pull open the button source and, oh, silly me, I put 25% opacity on every button. So let me save that and run those tests again. And now I just have this like one remaining issue. You can see how that fix propagated across every one of my stories because button is reused so often. And so, yeah, it's a kind of a simple, silly example, but this technique really works to not get overwhelmed at the page level and instead go to like buttons and tables and like your building block components. Fix the issues there first, then get to the page level ones, and you'll find that you can make pretty decent progress that way. Okay. That was all I really wanted to show for the demo. So let me go back. So we've covered this already. I just really want to hammer it home. The automated is the first line of defense, but there's a bunch that automated can't do. Like you cannot automate a screen reader. Um, Sometimes it can be difficult to judge the color contrast of like text over images or generated gradients or videos. Like there's lots of scenarios where that cannot be automatically detected, and so it needs manual verification. Uh, you cannot automate, at least yet, the fact that your animation is covered under the prefers reduced motion preference. So like it can't know that the animations turn off or like minimize like that. And then here's a really big one that's kind of subtle. Automation can tell you that there is alt text on images and you do have proper heading structure or ARIA descriptions, like all the text content. It can tell you that it's there, but it cannot tell you that it's actually useful. You have to have somebody that uses those pieces of information tell you, yeah, this actually informed me correctly of like what's going on this page. And there's a bunch more, but those are some of the key ones. And this is going to be a topic of our chat that Marcy and I are going to have in just a bit. Storybook, though, does help with going beyond automation. So you can publish your storybook, and then I don't know if you can, you probably can't see my cursor. There's a copy link button on every violation in the accessibility add-on. And so if you're on a published storybook and you click that copy link button, you can then send that link to anybody that can access that storybook, and it'll send them directly to that violation with it highlighted in the preview. And so it's really quick and easy to like, for instance, show your designer like, hey, this color contrast isn't good enough. What should I replace it with? You can also use what we call the play function, which is a way to just like simulate some behavior in a component. So you can kind of like simulate behavior or like entire user flows and show like in this flow, is it accessible? And that's built on a testing library, which uses querying language that tries to prioritize access. So for instance, instead of looking something up on like an ID attribute or something like that, it has you look it up based on the accessible role and the name that it has in accessible technology. So that's a good way to just kind of build best practices into your development practice. So that's our approach to accessibility. Developers should be empowered to fix their own issues, and you should be able to check the accessibility of every state of every component in your app. And the final thing I want to cover is so Storybook is built by or maintained by Pragmatic, which is kind of a cloud testing platform. We do visual testing, and very recently we're about to release accessibility testing, and we do something that as far as we can tell is pretty unique, where we do accessibility regression testing. So you can accept a violation for now, just so you can kind of like get a baseline and know where you're moving from, and then come back and revisit that later with a fix. It's just we built it specifically to solve that problem of an app interested in accessibility testing. They get going and they just have thousands of violations and don't know where to start. We designed this specifically to meet that criteria. And then it's also got like reporting and all kinds of stuff so that you can show your bosses the progress that you're making. So with that, I want to open it up to Q&A. I've seen a lively chat. I haven't been able to read most of it, but at this point, I'll start reviewing those.
Yeah, we've got some good questions. One that I could chime in with that I saw in the chat directly, going back to your storybook environment with the automated tests, there was a question about whether you can customize the WCAG level.
Oh,
I'm kind of
yes, you can.
curious, like, what can you customize in those settings?
Yeah, so we expose, we didn't used to, but we're working on it now. We expose every bit of the API of Axe Core. So you can change what specific rules you do. You can change what rule sets. So that's how you would do that, is like the WCAG 2.1 AA. That's a rule set. And so you can either you can opt into AAA, you can move that to WCAG 2.2 AA. You have total control over that.
Cool.
You can also do that not just for the whole project, you can do that for a component or even a very specific story of a component. So yeah, very, very granular level of control. Great question. Um,
Yeah,
okay.
Kyle, I'll jump in here real quick. I've been
Yeah.
keeping an eye on the chat. Yeah, so we that was from Casey, and Casey had a couple of other questions. And then we also have several over in the QA section.
Okay.
Um, I'll go ahead and mention the two other questions that Casey had. One
Sure.
was, what is the tech stack for your testing, and what's that based on? If you want to speak a little about that.
So for Storybook test, I'm guessing.
I believe that's Casey.
Yeah.
Correct us if
Okay.
I'm wrong, but I believe that's yeah.
Okay. So Storybook test is built on a bunch of different open source tools. So it's kind of we kind of took the best of what's available and combined it into one like batteries included solution. So tooting our own horn here, but Storybook obviously is one of those. We believe we're the best component-based development tool. And then I said it's based on VTest, and specifically it uses VTest's browser mode. So what it does is it'll render the story that's been transformed into a VTest test. It renders that in a real browser, and it does that by using Playwright. And so yeah, VTest will call Playwright. It'll pull up your story in a real browser, not a simulated one, which is really important, because that means that you're getting the like actual browser environment, and you don't have to like mock unavailable browser APIs and things like that. And then the accessibility component of it is the Axe core. The checks that you saw happening in the accessibility add-on, that is exactly what happens in the test as well.
Great. And there was one more that I was keeping track of. Again, Casey asked, does your accessibility testing include ARIA snapshot tree testing?
Ah, um, I think I think you're referring to like accessibility object model snapshot. That is something I'm personally looking into because I think that could be a really cool tool. So, like everything we talked about here, there's no like one single solution, but I think there's a chance that once you have something like you've done the accessibility tests, the automated ones, you've manually verified it, and maybe even you've had it audited. And so you've got like as strong a stamp of approval as you can find on what you've built and it's accessible. And you want to make sure it stays that way. Well, I think snapshotting that accessibility object model would be a really good proxy for whether or not it has maintained its accessibility. And so that's something that I definitely want to build in. I will say, since it's built on VTest, there's definitely libraries out there that do that sort of snapshot testing of the AOM. So it's possible we just have not built it into Storybook yet.
Yeah, I think something I could add since I've worked with Storybook a lot recently and snapshots, or that between like some of the existing tools that are already there, such as you mentioned using testing libraries, get by role, or
Mm-hmm.
and similar query APIs. Those are awesome because they can really catch changes in your underlying DOM structure and ARIA structure. Like I've had tests start failing all of a sudden because a role changed. So if you use those APIs in your automated tests, you can already catch some of those regressions for accessibility, which is solid. And at Khan
Yeah.
Academy, we have some snapshot tests of the markup. And so if that underlying markup changes, the ARIA would be reflected in that. So I think I'd be curious to know what exactly ARIA or accessibility tree snapshot testing, like what use cases does that really unlock for people is what I'd be curious about. Kind of
Mm-hmm.
putting my like, test product developer hat on there.
Yeah.
Because there are existing techniques that can catch some of those regressions, just, so you don't need to wait around for a mystery new tool. There was accessibility snapshot testing in Playwright, I believe, and it's cool. I just haven't seen it like really be like this killer feature that solves all of our problems for
Mm,
accessibility testing, because we can already look at the DOM, which would have ARIA reflected in it.
right. Yeah. Um, I think maybe one difference is the DOM would show, like, it's possible to have like multiple accessible names represented in the DOM, but ultimately only one wins, right? Like they kind of
Mm,
cascade, or there's like a
yep.
specificity to it. And so I think the accessibility, the AOM, only shows like the one that wins. And so it's a little
That's
less
a good point.
noisy in that regard.
Yeah, it could be like an
Um,
automated way of using, say, the Chrome accessibility inspector that I love and recommend to
yeah,
everyone. That
yes.
will show you which thing wins,
Hmm.
which is specified in the accessible name calculation spec. If you're not familiar with that, it's like that's the standard API. Like that's how those decisions are made. If you have ARIA label and ARIA label by and maybe even a paired label, it's like, well, they can't all win. There is a standard that browsers and accessibility or assistive technologies follow for that. But if you could automate that, that would be pretty sweet.
Yeah, that's exactly the lines I was thinking along. Yeah. Um, okay. I'm going to go through the Q&A now. And Marcy, can you see the Q&A as well?
Yeah,
Okay, so feel free to jump in and answer these too. It definitely does not have to be me.
sure. Yeah, I've been seeing some questions about support of various things like web components and stencil,
Okay.
Angular. So yeah, I guess kind of going back to tech stack questions, maybe it would be helpful to kind of zero in on like what has to be specific to say React or to Angular, because something I love about automated test tools, some of
Hmm.
them, they're kind of framework agnostic in some
Yeah,
ways, and so it's really about getting something that's rendered whether in memory or in the browser, if you're doing CI or actual browser testing. Sometimes the tooling is agnostic to the point where like you just write your tests and wire things up. So can you speak to that a little bit? Might
I
help people
can.
understand how this fits into a workflow when
Yeah.
there's infinite combinations
Yeah, yeah.
of tech stacks.
Right. All right. So the storybook test that I showed, and actually I'm just gonna stop sharing my or stop presenting just so I can go back to that. So um this experience here with the testing widget down at the bottom, that is done with an add-on called add-on vtest. As that name implies, it does require vtest. It also requires Vite. And so if you're using something in Storybook, it has to be built with Vite. And so until literally today, that excluded Angular, but they just announced experimental support for Vite. It does have some very strong caveats right now, but we've got our ear to the ground on that one. But for now, what it supports is primarily React, Vue, and Svelte are what Storybook Test works with. But we do have kind of a prior iteration of this called Test Runner, where it doesn't have anything in the Storybook UI available to you, but you can run it in the CLI. And it just works slightly differently, where it actually requires either a running or a published storybook, and then you pass it that URL, and it'll go visit those stories and do all the testing there. And there are recipes to do accessibility testing, and there's even one for the AOM snapshot testing through that tool.
Are you going to keep that tool around in case people are like in
Yes, for
a
now.
tech stack that isn't support it? So no Webpack.
Yes,
They had to
exactly,
sell that question. I have
exactly.
done like a Frankenstein tech stack where I have like one tool running Webpack and one's running something at like Parcel or whatever. So
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
you can combine tools. It's just it might not be the optimal workflow.
Yep, yep. Like we had a number of people on Next.js using Storybook, which is famously Webpack. Um, Although now they're building their own thing called TurboPack. But um, anyway, yeah. So it was Webpack, and they wanted to use Vite in Storybook though because it's so much faster. And so we built what we call a framework in Storybook that recreates all of Next.js's Webpack logic inside of Vite so that you can use it in Storybook and like get the testing and the speed and everything. And so they use Vite in Storybook and Webpack in production, and they're okay with that trade-off, but it is definitely a trade-off to have different builders in different environments.
More to maintain, right?
Yeah, and to maintain.
Yeah, more to
Although at
run
least with that
locally.
one, we're the ones maintaining that. so
Yeah.
so they don't have to worry about that. Okay. Using Axe Core under the hood. Yes, absolutely. And in fact, the way that you like configure this stuff, like if you wanted to say like, well, for this one, this particular rule doesn't matter because this story is documentation only. It's not like real. And I don't want my tests to be noisy. That's all done through Axe Core APIs directly. So like we just point you to the Axe Core documentation to learn how to do that.
Yeah, I see a related question on leveraging manual testing in combination with tooling like Xcore. Is there a quick way to map out what requirements are covered by the automated tools versus what needs to be covered by manual tests?
So
That's a
let me
good
show you
question.
something really, that is an excellent question. I don't know if, yeah, I don't know if I have an example of one. But so in the accessibility add-on, there's categories where there's violations, there's showing what passes, which is nice to know. Like, oh, it tested all of these things and they passed. That's cool. And then there's inconclusive. So this is stuff like that. I mentioned it can't check the color contrast if it's not on a solid color. So like if it's on text overlaying a video or something like that. So if it finds text overlaying something where it is unclear what the background color is, or it's like hard to discern, that'll show up in this inconclusive category. And it's like, hey, you should probably check this on your own. It looks like something that could maybe be a violation. Um, so Axcore does help you with that, and we surface that information here. I know DeQ has like an Axe DevTools Pro, like a paid tool that uses some machine learning techniques to actually try to guide you through checking the things that need manual checking. So it'll kind of give you like not just a to-do list, but even like an interactive kind of experience for doing it. It's quite innovative. I was pretty
Hmm.
impressed by it.
I think they might have moved to those inconclusives. You might also see them referred to as incompletes. I
Yeah.
worked on Xcore when that was introduced. I think
Yeah.
the last time I checked the Axe extension, they've moved all of that like needs review stuff into the paid
Hmm.
version potentially. I
Oh, okay.
either that or I couldn't find it. It
Okay.
changed a lot over the years, but I
Yeah.
use X all the time. But it is pretty much only like what is pass fail, what are violations. Those are the things that you should
Yeah.
fix first.
Yeah.
But it's anything that just it doesn't have like a clear pass fail. It goes into this other category of like, you're gonna have to look at this. This text is over a border, like something that's you just can't determine clearly with JavaScript. Like it ends up in that category. But I think there's other parts of the web content accessibility guidelines that like you can't even get close to with automation. So for that question, I'd have to do a Google search to find like, you know, what can and can't be automated. But there are things like quality of alt text. I saw some folks asking about that. Some of those more nuanced bits that require
Hmm.
human review just can't be automated.
Yeah.
I think the Axe team historically has said that Axe Core can automate like 50% of issues by volume. That number keeps moving and they keep raising the bar higher and higher. But there's still
Yeah.
a percentage, at least, you know, 25% or whatever their number is up to now,
Right.
that has to be checked by a human.
I can actually tell you that's
57%.
yeah, exactly. It's very top of mind. I was about to mention that. Um, but that's just an average. That's not an absolute number. So
And
depending
it's
on the
by
shape of your
volume.
project, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Um,
Yeah. So yeah, it depends on, like you say, the shape of your project, like what
yeah,
issues potentially are on a page. It's not like
yeah,
by WCAG criteria necessarily.
yeah, exactly, exactly.
But the ones that can
Okay.
be automated, like if you knock all those out and fix everything that's like, you know, easy wins and low hanging fruit, you can make a huge impact. So I think even if there are parts of a CAG that can't be automated, if you can identify and fix the easy ones, that leaves more time to like have your professional auditing team or your QA or even like whoever is in front of the screen looking at this, save some of that human like debugging power for the more nuanced things that you really have to consider and weigh scenarios, you know, for alt text. Like, is this a product image? Is
Yeah.
this a stock image that could be decorative? Like, you kind of have to look at
Yeah.
it and decide.
No, that's a great point. It is way more helpful to have an expert weigh in on whether or not the alt text that is there is helpful than to have them weigh in on, hey, this image doesn't have an alt attribute. Like that's silly. That can be automated. Don't waste experts' time on that. Get their value. Um, Marcy, I'd love to throw a question to you if that's all right. It's one of these in the
Sure.
Q&A. This is, what are some common gotchas when moving from testing accessibility on components to testing accessibility on full pages, or vice versa? So maybe like, what are some of the trade-offs of component level versus page level testing?
Sure. Yeah. So there's some page level accessibility tests that are useful to look at in the terms of a system or an overall page, such as color contrast. Like you could look at contrast in one specific component. If you have a brand system or a design system that has colors throughout, you're going to have a bigger challenge than just the color contrast in that one component. So sometimes you have to zoom out and look at the overall picture for some of the issues. Sometimes an issue might be page level, like does the document have a language specified with the lang attribute? We would consider that a page level accessibility test. Other ones, some of my favorites that break out of a single component concern are things like focus management, where you need to have focus moving around components. So maybe you have compound components, or maybe that's a page level test to say, okay, when I interact with these few components, my focus should go here, here, and here, and not here. Like I shouldn't get lost behind a modal dialogue, for example.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes it's like orchestrating multiple components together that it gives you a need for more of a page level testing space. So it can still be helpful, but sometimes page level tests are slow. There's a lot on a
Yeah.
page. There's a lot trying to load. Cypress tests can be a little bit slow sometimes, but they're still valuable because you might catch regressions that like you fix component A, didn't realize it was going to break component B. If you have page level tests, those serve a lot of purpose still.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. I see a question from Dakota about getting support on writing a drag and drop test using Storybook's play functionality. That is expert level stuff. We'd be happy to help. If you're in our Discord, that's probably the best place to ask. Otherwise, email me. It's just kyle@chromatic.com. Here, I'll put. Email me and I'll get it to the right person. And that goes for anybody's question. If you have a question here that didn't get answered, email it to me and I'll make sure that it gets answered somehow. Okay, somebody asked that I mentioned automation, but I still had to push a button to trigger a test. How does that help with automation? So for the sake of the demo, I kept it focused on local development, just like running a local storybook here. But everything that you saw with the testing can happen in your CI environment. You just have to call, you actually literally just call the vtest command in your CLI because it is literally just running vtest tests. It just happens to be those tests were stories before they were tests. That's really the storybook magic part of it there. But yeah, so it can very much be automated. I just didn't show the automation. There's also a watch mode that I didn't show. So I like manually clicked the run test button, but I didn't even have to do that. I could have just had watch mode on and it would automatically kick off all the relevant tests, including accessibility.
That's awesome. Yeah, it's like do you have programmatic tests that you can have a pass fail on? yeah, you could run those in CI, which
Yeah.
is super helpful because, like, say, you built a feature, you wrote some accessibility tests for it. Maybe you come back to it, or maybe your colleague works on it, and uh-oh, it broke. So if
Yep.
you have some accessibility contract with some of your tests, whether it's in testing library or in a Storybook test runner, having
That's right.
that peace of mind is so awesome.
That's right. And then just going to share a Discord link real quick because somebody asked about it. I think that's it. Andrew, can you check that that's the right link? Um, what was I going to say?
Yes, that is
Oh,
correct.
so you can mark in Storybook, and this affects your CI as well. You can mark accessibility violations to either be off, where they just don't show up. And again, this is true for the project, the component, or the story level. And so they can be off while you're like actively developing or something. Don't recommend that. That's just for like completeness sake that you can turn it off. There's a to-do status, which is what you saw me have, where everything shows up as a warning, and that will not throw an error in your CI. So like it will not block you being able to like merge your PR or whatever if it's a required status update. Or you can mark them as errors, and those show up as errors in the Storybook interface, and in your CI environment they do throw an error, and so you will not be able to get past a required check if there are errors there. And so what we recommend is error by default, and then anything that has current accessibility issues that you're actively working on, change that to do, and then it operates as a to-do list for working through your accessibility debt. So you can just do a find for to-do, find it everywhere where can you show how to set? Yes, I'd love to. Let me just share my
Yeah,
screen again.
while you're pulling that up, I could speak to some of the stuff. Like, the settings are really helpful, so you can configure where you have things blow up. Like, you want an accessibility test to fail at critical times when either multiple people's code is coming together, and like that's the first time that you can go take action, or your own stuff. Like the earlier the better, because if you have accessibility tests running like later down in your deployment workflow, like by that point you might already have like deploy branches that have already been reviewed, and like your time to fix them has passed. So I think it's nice to be able to configure it when you're in a position to take action, or when multiple developers code is being integrated for the first time. Like those are the points, kind of practically speaking, that would be the most useful. Whereas like later on, having accessibility violations fail, like as long as you're catching stuff earlier in your workflow, like that might be a point where you could disable some of those checks.
Yeah, yeah, good point. So here's the actual like API for changing those levels. So when you install either the accessibility add-on when you already have Storybook Test, or vice versa, um, it will add this this little bit of configuration to your Storybook. So you configure the behavior of stories and tests and stuff through parameters. And so there's parameters, accessibility, and then test. And it has 3 levels: to do, error, and off. And there's kind of some explanatory comments here on like what does what. And again, this is in our what we call the preview configuration file. So that affects every story across the entire project. But I could also put it just in like buttons stories file to affect every button story, or I can put it on an individual story to just affect that one thing.
Very cool.
Yeah,
I could take on a question from Dan
please.
Green. He said, we have a challenge where no single department owns accessibility. As engineers, we can implement automated accessibility testing, but at the end of the day, if no one is reading the reports and deciding to take action, issues persist for years. That is so true. That can happen anywhere, until you hire an expert and they're like, well, I'm going to go dig up this issue that's been kicking around for years. I've been doing some of those in various jobs of mine. It's like somehow it has to be part of your definition of done, part of the like agreement that we are going to fix it. So I think my advice would be to find small actionable chunks that you can just get things going. and make it part of your regular workflow so that everybody can take some of the responsibility, which I think is healthy if you can have like it just be part of your regular process. Break it down into smaller parts and see what easy wins you can fix, and then say, hey, we're doing it. We fix some stuff. We can just make it a regular thing. Take some time with every PR to go test it with the keyboard. Write some accessibility tests like, hey, I'm writing some JavaScript for an interactive component. I have automated tests. Why not write some accessibility tests for it and make sure that the keyboard events work and stuff like that? It can be really useful as long as everyone chips in. But at the end of the day, like you say, it has to be part of your agreement of what you're going to do. Responsibility, hot potato.
Yeah. Andrew, you mentioned there were some web components conversations.
Yeah, there's a couple of questions about web components and Shadow DOM.
So first off, we're working on web component support for Storybook test, that thing that I showed you. However, it does work for the accessibility add-on itself. So like you won't get the automation part, but you can manually use the add-on just like a browser extension. But more generally, I think you're probably talking about how there can be tricky issues that come up when you're using Shadow DOM and web components with accessibility. As far as I know, there have not been very, very much growth or developments in that area. Marcy, maybe you have some insight here.
Yeah, one of my earliest conference talks and research areas was on Shadow DOM. So a couple things come to mind. One, Shadow DOM ends up in a page as rendered. So like to a user with a keyboard or a screen reader, it's just like one tree. So you can access it with a screen reader. You can use your keyboard. That said, there are some nuances. Is it open Shadow DOM or closed Shadow DOM? Closed Shadow DOM would be something like a video player. Like it has controls in it. Can you reach and operate those? I don't know. It depends how it's made. Your automated tooling, like getting in there and testing that might need some further exploration. And then there's also like unique IDs being scoped in a Shadow DOM subtree. Like that is historically been one of the trickier bits, like for automated tooling to sort out, and even the web APIs themselves. So those are kind of the two areas that I would look into. Just know that if you have a Shadow DOM component on a broader page, the user will just see it as rendered. It's all one thing.
Thanks for your insight there.
Yeah.
I have a question of my own here. If somebody's just getting started on their journey to make their UI more accessible, do you have a recommendation on like what sorts of violations, so like color contrast issues, missing ARIA labels, like what's best to start with just to have the most impact as fast as you can?
Sure. Yeah, a couple things come to mind as we're wrapping up here. Any of the violations that come up in an extension like Axe or Lighthouse, those are like easily fixable most of the time. Issues. Sometimes if you're in a big organization, it can take time. Slower moving ships, even the easiest of changes sometimes can be tricky. But as for what to prioritize, those violations in WCAG, I would prioritize those over best practices because they're pretty clean cut usually. There's a project called the WebAIM Million that I would recommend checking out. It's from a group called WebAIM out of Utah, and they run their Wave API against the top 1 million homepages periodically to find how are organizations doing? What's the health of the web for accessibility? And so some of those top 5 or 6 issues would be ones to look at. And that's things like button text or button names, color contrast, form labels, whatever they list as like, those are the most common ones. You could do everyone a favor by fixing those on your site.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that idea of like correlating what you should fix with like
Mm-hmm.
the internet as a whole kind of suggests should be fixed. That's
Yeah.
wise.
What are the common pitfalls?
Hmm.
And we are out of time, but there was one question about suggestions for designers with respect for accessibility. And that
Yeah.
was something that came to mind for me earlier in your presentation, was just that accessibility really is a team responsibility. Like, it comes up in design even earlier in like requirements gathering via personas. Like, are they all able-bodied people, or are people with
Mm.
disabilities really considered in your product DNA of like who this is for?
Mhm.
So it can come up in various parts of a product and software development lifecycle, but there are some parts for design specifically, like use of color. Heading structure could be thought of in the design phase, and pairing, like designers and developers pairing together to help each other and to make sure that focus indicators are working. Like, there's a lot of opportunity to work together and pair to come up with the best thing.
Um, I know we are at time, but I just wanted to hit this topic one more time, and especially get your thoughts, Marcy, if it's okay.
Sure.
So I want to talk about that boundary between automated and manual accessibility testing, just one last time to kind of end the session here. So what does
Sure.
that look like in your experience, and do you have any tips for navigating that?
Yeah. Well, manual testing is just so essential. It's something I do all the time. Can I get a URL to test that? I'm usually the one asking, like, how do I actually test this so I can pull it up in a browser? Running a browser extension. Sometimes when I'm writing automated tests, I'm also testing manually to make sure my automated test is actually valuable. It's like,
Yeah.
what is the browser doing? So I'm often going back and forth just to make sure that I'm not missing anything. I'm looking at the DOM to see like what's actually getting rendered here. So I think they're both aspects of a job of the job of front end development that are really important to include. And then, yeah, figure out what you can automate, things that are programmatic, pass fails. Get those tests baked in, like your custom keyboard tests. Those are best suited for your own automation, whereas a browser extension is going to be a little more general. It's not going to look at your keyboard events necessarily.
Right.
So I'd say they're both super important.
Okay. I think that's an excellent note to end on. Thank you, Marcy, so much for joining us here. Really
Yeah,
appreciate it, and your expertise that you could share. Thanks everybody for joining us. Thanks, Andrew, for helping moderate. And I hope everybody has an excellent rest of their day, however much of that may remain.
go test with your keyboard.